Welcome to Charity Village Connects. I'm Mary Barrell. For many thought leaders in the nonprofit sector, the minority rather than the majority have had the lion's share of influence on shaping policies that impact charities for far too long. Although the vast majority of charities in Canada are small, a minority of larger, well funded organizations have dominated public discourse, influenced government policy, and regulation of the sector. We'll take a closer look at what the impacts have been historically and what we can do to make access to influence more fair and equitable and more reflective of the sector and the communities it serves. To help us understand these important issues, please welcome Stephen Ayer. Stephen is the president of Common Good Strategies, a social purpose consultancy helping clients use data and evidence to make meaningful and lasting social impact. Stephen is a sought-after public speaker, a well-respected author, and has worked on some of the most influential reports about the Canadian nonprofit sector in recent years. Welcome back to the podcast, Stephen.
Thank you for having me again.
Well, as we open up our discussion today on the equity of representation among charities and nonprofits in Canada, can you give us some data on how many active charities and nonprofits there are, and what proportion are small organizations versus the larger ones?
Yeah, it's a question that sometimes can be surprisingly challenging to answer. On charities, we have really good data. We know there's about 85,000 charities. If we look in terms of size, about 55,000 of those have less than 2 million in revenue. Several thousand are really large with more than 25 million in revenue. And then you have a bunch of in between. So we look and see like there's really a relatively sizable number of folks who have no staff whatsoever, probably about half of the charities in the country. And then on the nonprofit side, it's a much harder question to answer. We don't have regular ongoing data about revenue, staff levels, and all that sort of thing for nonprofits. So we often look at a few different data sets we have to sort of estimate. And we see that there's probably a similar number of nonprofits in this country as there are charities. And in terms of size, a lot of them are on the smaller end. Like when we talk about charities as a concept, like one of the things we always have to keep in mind, and for some of the folks on the listening might be very familiar, is charities is such a broad concept. We have everything from hospitals, universities, colleges, some library boards, school boards, rolled in with your small local organization that might have absolutely no staff, a whole bunch of volunteers enthusiastically doing something, and you have other ones that are some of the largest organizations in the entire country. And these are all wrapped up in the concept of what we call charities. And often when we're talking about a charitable sector, it's sometimes important to distinguish, like, are we talking about community nonprofits, which really refer to a lot of those organizations? I think a lot of people are thinking of the first things that come to mind, or are we looking at some of the more governmental ones, which includes those hospitals, the ones that like universities and colleges that are very heavily funded by government or school boards or things like that, versus some of the ones that might be funded predominantly by donations or fees on some of the services they're providing in the community or support from foundations. And there is certainly a very large difference between a lot of these different organizations.
So if we narrow in on, let's say, charities in particular, but nonprofits as well, but those that focus on social services, environmental issues, those kinds of things, as opposed to more established educational institutions and hospitals per se. As you know, obviously there's charitable arms of those as well that are and foundations, etc. But if we focus on those, like, how do we look at the proportionate size of small organizations versus the larger ones?
Yeah, and I think it does get a little bit more equal when we look at there, because I mean, a lot of the when you get into those government-oriented ones, like you have these billion-dollar institutions, and I think when you sort of lump that data together with a lot of the smaller ones, it really diminishes the relative consequence of the nonprofits. I mean, we look at some of the data we have on the governmental sphere. I mean, it is the majority of the revenue of charities, and so certainly when we get into that community nonprofit size, it's a much smaller portion of staff and revenue that goes in. This is an area when we talk about inequality, we see there's pretty striking differences in terms of pay. I mean, If we look at the governmental nonprofit side of things, like data from StatsCan for 2021 shows they're paid pretty much the same as employees in general.
So, sorry,
Uh,
what are you talking about when you say governmental
Yeah,
nonprofits
so
in
that's a lot
terms?
of those hospitals, universities,
Right,
colleges, sorts of
right.
like those sorts of more roles. I mean, typically, even when we look at like say pay, they're about paid about the same as a typical worker in the economy. And I think when we look at the nonprofit side of things, where the community nonprofit, a lot of the spaces might think about social services that like homeless shelters, food banks, some of these arts and culture nonprofits or recreation organizations. This is where we see a real big difference with about 30% lower pay amongst that sort of, and that's I think one of the initial inequalities we see, a really striking difference in terms of compensation for folks who are working in that community nonprofit sector. And of course, that is flowing from some of the choices around how they're funded. Many of those government funded nonprofits do receive substantial amount of funding from government, and part of that is going towards relatively strong compensation for those who work for them. For the community nonprofits that are often smaller, don't have as regular funding, we see this number one, this really large disparity in terms of wages, and it really does flow a lot of different things as well, because in terms of money for infrastructure, money for administrative costs, money to invest in new programs, like there's a lot of gaps there as well for the community nonprofit sector.
Okay, so if we focus on, I'd like to sort of focus our discussion on, I guess, what the public generally thinks of as charities, and that would include larger organizations like the World Wildlife Foundation or Sick Kids or whatever, as opposed to, I would say, much more institutional sort of organizations like universities, um, uh, you know, um, and hospitals, for example. If we focus on the kind of organizations that do community work, social services, environmental concerns, other kinds of causes of that nature, um, what is the breakdown in terms of the big players versus the small ones? As I understand it, certainly among charities, you're seeing a great deal of small charities versus the much larger, well-funded ones.
Yeah, no matter which way you slice it, the vast majority of organizations are small. The vast majority of organizations like don't even have resources to have staff, and that is because they have next to no resources. So, like when you're talking about sort of what most people think of the nonprofit sector, it is typically, I mean, I think the number I used, I already mentioned, was like 55,000 of the 85,000 charities are $2 million in revenue or less. So the majority are not very large, and correspondingly often come with no staff accompanying that organization. Certainly, some of them have many have part-time staff, many use contract staff to sort of deliver services. But like when we talk about a lot of what the typical experience is, it's very different from what people might be thinking about in these large organizations.
So is there any data available on how funding is generally divided up among these organizations? Is it proportional, or are large organizations getting the lion's share of funding? And what is the rationale for that, if that's true?
Yeah, so we look in 2022, we saw about $21.9 billion were reported by charities on their tax returns. Of that, the top 150 receiving charities reported total donations of $8.2 billion of that. So that's just 150 charities making up not quite half, but a pretty sizable portion. Like when we go to a slightly larger share of organizations that have at least $25 million in annual revenue, we see the 8.8 billion in tax receipted gifts. So it's really concentrated. And one of the things as well, when we look at over time, we see this inequality has grown quite substantially. So over the last decade, as an example, a recent review by Imagine Canada looked at how much tax receipted gifts increased overall and found in general, adjusting for inflation, the amount of tax receipted gifts going to charities increased by 22% over the decade ending in 2022. And of that, the increase, 66% of it went to those top 150 organizations. Small organizations, the ones that make up the majority of the sector, on an inflation-adjusted basis, actually saw their share of their total revenue decline. So organizations in the middle saw a bit of an increase, but a few organizations saw a gigantic increase, really taking the lion's share of the increase in tax-treated gifts, and the majority of the organizations actually saw an inflation-adjusted decrease in the amount of donations they're receiving. So, I mean, I think, in terms of, we started off very concentrated, and then as the decade has progressed, we've gotten far more concentrated and into a system that was already pretty concentrated to start with.
So why is that? Is there any kind of data about what's causing this in particular? Is it about higher marketing budgets among the larger organizations? Is it I guess a mistrust of the public for smaller organizations, how well they're run, etc. What is there anything that can explain this?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple different pieces to it. I mean, number one, I mean, I think if we look at the types of organizations that are in that top 150, like we can see it's a very particular set of organizations that have seen really large increases in funds. I mean, it's things like donor advised funds that have seen the amount of funds that they receive more than double over that decade. It's a lot of grant making foundations, some of which are, many of which are private foundations and funded by particular families, where again we've seen almost a doubling of the amount of tax-related gifts those organizations are getting on a typical year. And so, like, what's the really things we really see? I mean, these are typically vehicles that are relatively oriented towards wealthier individuals. And as wealth has increased substantially in the country, they're often using foundations as well as donor advised funds to use as a vehicle for distributing funds. So, like, where that money goes once it goes into these organizations is a very tricky question to do, to look at, because you have to kind of look foundation by foundation to see where does the money go, how fast is it flowing through these organizations, is it immediately being sent to other charities that might be more representative of a typical charity, or is it in many cases aggregated and growing in these foundations and not being distributed on a rapid basis. And these are much harder questions to answer. The other piece, yeah, go ahead. I mean, the other piece, I think, when we look at like why organizations are growing, it is broadly a function of how our economy works. I mean, if you look, back in history at the largest corporations in the country. I mean, if we look now, like, I mean, what RBC might be. I mean, this is a $230 billion market cap now. 25 years ago, it was 30. I mean, our economy has not grown anywhere near that big. But if you look at the typical company on the stock exchange, it's about 6 or 7 times bigger than it would have been 25 years ago, whereas the overall economy has grown by 3 or 4 times. And so I think this is really a pattern we see, is that organizations with resources tend to get bigger because they can invest in things like marketing, they can invest in brand, they can invest in the fundraisers that allow them to get resources. And this pattern we see both in the charitable sector as well in the broader economy. And the charitable sector is not immune to these sorts of broad trends that show that it is easier for resources to go to those who are able to invest in both like the sort of marketing and sales and fundraising staff, and just like they're able to put the infrastructure in place that allow them to grow really rapidly.
And so I guess the question would be then, it's not just about funding, but also among all the charities in Canada, when it comes to accessing or influencing regulations that govern them, including the manner in which they are able to fundraise, including the opportunities to consult with government. Are we seeing equitable representation in the sector in that regard as well? Or does this inequity continue?
Well, I think in terms of resources, like it's only a select number of organizations that are able to actually have resources for dedicated public policy staff. And I mean, certainly anyone who's able to invest in that is going to have a disproportionate share of voice on anything around public policy. In the broader perspective, like I think a lot of organizations, like in terms of what they're most interested in, I mean, it's perhaps a little less on the sort of how are they regulated and how, in opposed to like how are they funded. And like I think where a lot of organizations are concerned is sometimes less on the federal level, because a lot of these organizations do not receive any federal funding whatsoever. So a lot of the conversation around like how charities should be regulated, home and government for charities, these sorts of things are very concentrated on this concept question of a federal funding. And for most of these nonprofits, that's a very distant question for them. I mean, if they are particularly interested in government, they're very interested often in local government and what are the decisions and how do they help influence local government, which is another area that there is obviously substantial discrepancies in how people have access to resources at local government as well as provincial government. But they're much more likely to be funded by local government or provincial government government in a lot of cases than federal. So many of the issues we spend the most time discussing might seem quite distant for a typical charity, where they might not have that many opinions on, like, is a home of government going to be beneficial for them, where they are very, very concerned with, like, how am I going to keep the doors open? How am I going to pay the bills? How do I give a raise for staff? Like, how do I make sure that someone has adequate, some of my staff are getting adequate compensation? Like, we're seeing this growing need for food in the community. Like, why is no one flowing funds to us to help support that? I mean, these are the sorts of questions I think they're really particularly concerned about, and less so, I mean, it's about some of the big picture federal questions that I think we spend a lot of time discussing. And I think probably the issues that they're most interested in, some of those local and municipal issues in terms of funding, because they're often, neighborhood organizations or single community organizations. They're focused on people in a specific community. And I think a lot of times people might feel like, well, these issues that are the most critical for us are ones that are actually being ignored altogether.
Well, certainly, most of the funding that goes to a lot of the charities that are doing social service workers are really part of a fee for service. Obviously, the federal government provides funding to the provinces, who then decide who's they're going to fund. So the direct relationship is really with the province or the municipality for a lot of the smaller charities, and the larger ones as well. But certainly, I'm talking about representation in public policy discussions, things that where they would be influenced by the outcome of decisions of government, whether it's federal or provincial, or even more local than that.
Yeah, and I think like in terms of the sort of the differences, like, I mean, at every level, will of course see differences in terms of people's ability to access that, and I think in the sorts of ability to influence discussion around where federal priorities lie. I mean, certainly, I think a lot of folks would feel like they have next to no voice in terms of how that's being influenced, let alone at the provincial. I mean, I think local might be the one area where there is at least some opportunity to access things in some cases, maybe less so in some of the biggest cities. But I think at sort of every level of, the things that affect them, there's probably a relative feeling that, like, the perspective may not be fully heard. And I do think, on that funding piece is, like, most people don't understand how the funding flows. Most people don't know what's the responsibility of various levels of government, and or who has resources versus doesn't, or, like, even how income tax flows from the feds to the provinces versus other sorts of things. So I think a lot of people, like, some of these questions are, like, probably the nuance gets lost on people, and I'm sure a lot of people feel like their voices aren't heard because they don't quite grasp, like, why the priority is on one thing over another. And especially, I think the funding will always be the number one issue, and people certainly feel now more than ever that demand for services has exploded, but funding has not. And all they really can tell is, for whatever reason, resources are not flowing to help accommodate that. And I think, like, a lot of the gap will be more like, why is this not being addressed? And I think, like, in terms of feeling voiced, like, when you don't see the results, that's probably one of the biggest gaps in terms of how people feel about whether their perspectives are being reflected by any of the levels of government.
I guess I would question, I mean, public policy and the choices of any particular party that might be elected, and how they're going to address problems that they see in society, whether it's crime or anti crime or protecting the public, or whether it's social services, or supports for people who are marginalized, or uh, struggle with poverty, or the homelessness issue, is really relevant to a lot of the work that these organizations do. And I'm curious then, um, and it's relevant to the decision on who, for example, the way in which a particular government might focus their program on funding, which would then go through, of course, the provincial governments to distribute. But surely there's a relevance to having some kind of voice for the sector. And what I'm curious about is whether the majority of the organizations have a voice, or whether it's dominated by a minority of larger organizations.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a tricky question, like in terms of like I wouldn't say we have a huge amount of data on this. I mean, in terms of some of the things we do know is relatively few organizations say they're doing any policy work. So there's certainly not many, and those who are doing it tend to be larger organizations. And I think like with the question of like the extent to which these small organizations feel like their voices are being included and perspectives are being included, certainly I can't recall off the top of my head any research that shows it, but I mean, they certainly don't have the resources to do it themselves. And so if folks aren't very proactively reaching out to be able to involve them in the opportunities to influence stuff, I think, they wouldn't, I can't see it'd be very likely they'd feel like they're getting a lot of, opportunity to have their voice heard in these sorts of conversations.
So I guess there has been a lot of discussion about whether charities generally their access to decision makers in government that would make the call on programming that they were prepared to fund from the federal government or even the provincial government is problematic because there's no home in government. There was huge advocacy to try and engage um, the government in considering creating a home in government, but we haven't seen that happen after many years of advocacy to that extent. I mean, what is your thoughts about that? Is that one of the reasons why there's minimal influence from in terms of the federal reach of some of the advocacy of charitable organizations across Canada?
Yeah, it's a tricky question, and I think in terms of a lot of I mean, so there's a variety of sorts of things, and I think like when we look at different facets of the charitable sector, like certain ones that when we talk about have different groups they belong to, and might have certain priorities that they feel are represented either directly through the charitable or through the specific subsector they might be involved with. So like there can also be probably pretty substantial differences how people feel the answer to that question based off of the certain other groups they're also participating in and the degree to which like they might have some success in doing that. I think in terms of the rationale for a home in government, certainly like a lot of these funding issues, the hope would be if there's a home for government, they can be addressed through one spot. Whereas one of the things that makes it very hard to have successful policy is a lot of these funding buckets are controlled by different federal departments, and let alone what you get into the provincial transfer issues and then how provincial resources are allocated. For most of these organizations in aggregate, like the majority of the funding does come from the provinces, sometimes through fundings that's transferred federally. There's of course a huge amount of complicated things around how revenues shared between governments, and that affects how much those provincial governments have to be able to flow to their local governments. And I think, of course, you have the sort of a lot of questions like how is there sufficient administrative funding built into contracts if you're receiving them from any of these governments? Like this is the thing that's decided now at a department by department basis, or a lot of the sorts of things about like the conditions of how you apply for funds. Like they're all going to be done on a department by department basis, which makes it very inefficient to sort of try and make any change. So I mean, certainly in terms of the discussion around a home for government, the hope would be if it's centralized, like a lot of these things could be done in a much more streamlined basis. Like I do think in terms of a lot of those issues, like I mean, I think for a lot of the small local organizations, like I mean, again, most of them don't have staff. They're probably hard for them to wrap their head around. Like I think a lot more, like a lot of things like so much issues around food insecurity growing these days, or local homelessness issues, and the question they don't really fully comprehend is like why are there not more resources flowing to the community? And I think like what they see is more like we're having all sorts of people coming to us needing food. We don't have funds for that. Why? How do we get funds? And I think that's where you get the various levels of government. I mean, people feeling like, I mean, a bit of powerlessness because none of the levels of government are providing them support for meeting the needs they're seeing on the ground. And I think like a lot of the particular challenges for folks probably comes from the fact that like sometimes the issues they're seeing, like there's just no obvious way for them to get funding for it. And, I think in concept, a lot of people I'm sure would appreciate how, in the long term, having a home in government might be able to make some improvements. In the short term, it might seem like a bit of a concept like a bit separate from their day-to-day realities.
I guess, yeah, good in theory, but not so much in practicality.
Yeah.
Uh, I've heard that from other folks that are not convinced that that's the best way forward as well.
Well, I mean, it's hard to say. Like, I mean, whether the typical person would think it's the best way forward or not is probably not. Whether it might be or not is a much harder question to answer. Like, I think, like in terms of the specific sort of on the ground funding, like one of the things we do see is there is relatively few mechanisms to have for funds to go directly from the federal government to local charities. I mean, during the pandemic, we saw a very notable exception with some of the funds that was flowing through Community Foundations of Canada and the United Ways that went directly from federal governments to local communities. And I think, like, for a lot of folks, like, that's the sort of stuff that seems very, very, obvious on the ground. Money's coming from the federal government. It's granted to local communities as part of the emergency community support funds. Like, I think for a lot of people, that's what they hope to see more of out of government. Or even a lot of the programs that were announced during the pandemic, where there was support for direct staffing that came through the federal government, or some of the other programs that came through the federal government. But for the most part, for most people, like, the pandemic was the first time they saw the opportunity to participate in any sort of federal government. But by and large, I think like a lot of them, like, that would be the sort of stuff they'd love to see. Is just like we saw it for a couple of years during the pandemic, and for the most part, it's now back to the old status quo, which is you don't get any money from the federal government if you're most charities.
Right. So I guess the other piece of it is there any data to show whether traditionally marginalized organizations, such as Black or Indigenous led organizations, continue to be disproportionately impacted by any inequities that are existing, or have things improved? I mean, there's been foundations that have been created. There's for the Black communities, there's important sort of changes that would allow for um, charitable gifts to non-qualified donees that were intended to help organizations on the ground that weren't charities, and in many cases, in indigenous communities would have those. Um, do we have any data yet on whether anything has improved, and uh, what is the data showing if there's improvements in equity or not?
Yeah, it's a challenging question to answer, and like I think anytime we talk about whether something has improved, like, I think there's a lot of really concrete example of things we've seen how to have improved. Like, in a lot of cases, they started from a particularly challenging perspective, and even improvements might be nowhere near adequate where they need to be. But I think when you talk about some of the initiatives that have been announced, like, there's certainly some improvements. I think the scale of where we've gone versus where people they need to go can be an entirely separate question. I mean, so if we look at funding, like, one of the things we saw analysis by within Indigenous communities, Canadian Charity Law did an analysis with Mark Bloomberg and a number of different folks from Indigenous communities who sort of looked at, like, what was the amount of funding going to from foundations to Indigenous organizations, and they saw it was about 0.5% of all granting went to Indigenous organizations or Indigenous groups. They haven't done that analysis again, as far as I'm aware, but like 0.5%, and the Indigenous peoples represent about 4.5% of the population. A group out of Carleton wrote the unfunded report, and likewise found like a fraction of a percent was going towards Black-led Black serving groups, sort of started by the community. So, like, certainly we see, like, there's very little resources. So, like, on a proportional basis. So, like, if we start from where that is, even if there has been an improvement, it still has a long way to go. Like, in terms of improvement, like, we do see data from like Canada Helps us periodically put some data out through their giving report about giving to Indigenous causes, and certainly in 2022 there was a pretty sharp increase in the amount of giving to Indigenous causes from individuals. Of course, like, with a lot of the sorts of increases, we saw similar increases at certain points of the pandemic, with increased funding to Black and sort of other marginalized groups. But like, there's a huge peak, and then it declines, and often does stay higher than it was before. But it is certainly, like, a lot of people have been studying it to find, like, Benevity did a study with employee giving and found a gigantic increase initially to Black serving organizations. But it declined pretty sharply. I don't think all the way back to where it was before, but like the initial pieces of initial waves of enthusiasm can be hard to sustain. So I think like there's certainly a lot of cases like things went up a lot and then kind of back down a little bit when we do have concrete data. But the room for improvement often is pretty substantial. So even though there are probably some pretty promising signs compared to historical rates, they're often not adequate.
So I guess it does seem, I mean, we've discussed this earlier that at least anecdotally, and certainly there's a lot of data to show, at least in terms of funding, that a small number of large or more entrenched organizations seem to get the lion's share of funding, as well as opportunities, presumably for advocacy and speaking on behalf of the sector. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts on what needs to happen to create more equity in this regard.
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that I think has a lot of different answers. And one of the things like I've personally been involved with is the Changemaker Wellbeing Index by Future of Good, where we're doing a survey where we're attempting to do a relatively representative sample of nonprofit workers and asking them about their well-being. And I think one of the things that like when we do even surveys of workers, we tend to get folks from relatively large organizations, relatively resource organizations who have the time to fill out a survey. And so with that project that's coming out shortly, the key thing was really trying to get like what are the frontline service workers feeling, what are their needs, what are their what's the state of their mental health, their burnout, their food insecurity, what do they feel about their jobs. And I think like you're trying to do more work to really try and reflect the experiences of the typical person, and opposed to just some of the relatively more senior, relatively better paid folks that are often the folks who are answering surveys or have the time to be involved with consultations. I think that can be a really important piece. Like, so when folks are doing any sort of work where they're trying to collect the perspectives of community, really doing the very, very hard work of trying to make sure you are representing the typical worker who often, a lot of folks, are frontline workers. So like it's incredibly hard if you're, on the front lines to actually take the time to fill a survey. You might not be at a desk all day. And so like when you are sort of even collecting opinions, trying to do the work of figuring out like how underrepresented are frontline workers in whatever you're collecting, and how could you try and figure out, can you weight your results to sort of have a perspective that might be more reflective? I mean, similarly, when you're trying to talk to organizations, trying to make sure like, how, skewed is your data to some of the respondents who are some of the largest organizations, when you're doing consultations, trying to make sure that we are going to different parts of the country, trying to sort of reach some of these smaller organizations. And ultimately, like, when organizations have no staff, it's going to be much, much, much harder to reach them. When we talk about how we reach someone who doesn't sit at a computer all day because they're actually delivering services, it's going to be much harder to reach them. We still have to do the work to do that, and like make sure that we're doing our analysis so we can highlight what their voices and perspectives are and what they think might be some of the solutions for the challenges they're facing, in addition to some of the perspectives of some of the relatively well-resourced folks that often get the chance to speak. Like, I mean, I think one of the things when we look at the results from our surveys, about a third of nonprofit workers in the survey were food insecure, and that rose above 50% among some of the service workers, particularly frontline service workers. I mean, and so when you think about like some of their perspectives, like, I mean, half of people who are doing service work in the nonprofit sector say they're food insecure. I mean, that is, I mean, for a lot of people, like that is a utter crisis, and that is their day-to-day lives. And so a lot of these other issues, I don't think they necessarily say they're not important, but like in terms of their day-to-day sort of emergency needs to like have enough food to be able to eat, to feed their families, like these are really pressing issues that I think a lot of people would, they're predominantly concerned is like they're not being addressed. They're not, when you have a 50% food insecurity rate, maybe it's gotten better, probably not, but like that is a gigantic number, and one that is going to be people's predominant concern for a lot of people, maybe even a huge portion of the small organizations. Like that is their day-to-day reality. They're wondering, they might be, if they're getting paid, like nowhere near adequate for sort of what they need to thrive. So like this is their day-to-day concern, where for some of the folks who are representing the sector and who have the sort of loudest voices, they're usually relatively well paid, relatively secure spaces. So like they have the luxury sometimes of thinking about some of these other issues where folks who are in the most vulnerable positions, like their basic needs are not often being met.
And you're talking about people that are actually employed and not those that are volunteering. Is that correct?
That's correct.
That is really stunning to learn of. That's really, really concerning. And I understand what you're saying is why their focus might be very distinctly different than those that are able to have a more influential voice within the sector, obviously. Um,
Yeah, I think like one of the things, it's easy when you're like a lot of the folks who are working in policy. I mean, they're going to be well above average compensation. A lot of the folks who are representing foundations or they're lawyers who are they're able to retain because they're relatively resourced. Like none of these folks are experiencing that day to day reality. So it's harder for them to understand and appreciate the perspective that so many folks are facing. And I think it really is pretty staggering when you think like how widespread it is versus if you go into the typical room where people are talking about policy, chances are like no one's food insecure, or very few folks are food insecure at the very least. I don't want to make unfair assumptions, but these are the sorts of folks who have the opportunity to spend time talking about what we need to prioritize.
right. And I guess, well, I mean, that is a perfect example as to what the problems are, but I want to look more broadly and have some sort of concrete examples of at least what was noticeable in the sector. So, for example, asking the question, well, what are the problems that are caused by the larger, well-funded organizations having the greatest influence and voice, and whether there's examples of the issues that it causes. And I, in my mind, and I certainly heard this from others that I've interviewed for this episode, that the disbursement quota issue, for example, and the advocacy to increase it from 3.5% to 5%, and how long it took to do that, is one example of the strength of the voices from extremely well funded, well organized organizations that were able to delay the increase. I wonder if you could comment on that and other examples that come to mind.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the things when we talk about what is the perspective of the typical person working in the nonprofit sector, and it of course has to be balanced against others. But I mean, when we look at those 50% of folks who do service work who are struggling to pay for food, like I think a lot of the debates around like how much should the disbursement go up or like what are the downsides. I mean, they seem so contrary to their day to day experiences. I mean, folks are like struggling to meet their most basic needs, and I'm sure a lot of them when they look at questions like should the disbursement go up or not, if they explain to them like what the consequences of a disbursement quota increase, are probably somewhat confused why it hasn't been increased already and isn't continuing to go up further. And so I think like that is an example of for a lot of these folks, like the sorts of conversations and the opposition to them is probably seems very out of touch to their day-to-day lives.
Right. But I guess what I'm talking about is the advocacy that happened around that, where um, certainly there was a great number of people that had to come together to advocate for the increase in the disbursement quota. And up until that point, there'd been a lot of pushback, mainly from those that did have a voice in the sector, that had influence, that were well funded. I wonder, you could address that. I mean, it was about foundations and the fact that they were sitting on billions of dollars and hundreds of billions of dollars, and only were required to put out 3.5% of each per year to fund charitable causes. So that seemed like an example of the challenges that are and the problems that are created when that happens.
And I do think that it's a very visible example because I think when you look at the typical perspective, I mean, when people are struggling to meet the demand for services, they're struggling to pay staff, their staff are struggling to afford food. I mean, I think like these sorts of conversations and the fact that like there is such pushback for most people is probably seems pretty bewildering, to be honest. I think when you look at the choices of topics that get prioritized, probably similarly, a lot of the things that we spend a lot of time talking about. I think for many people, like, they're not going to dive into it because that's, beyond the scope of what they're doing. But I think like I would imagine a lot of folks like would be pretty disillusioned with some of the process of what gets prioritized and what actually goes through, and what gets a significant amount of pushback.
So, are there strategies that smaller organizations can actually use to gain a greater share of funding and access to government or influence that has, a distinct impact on the potential funding that they would get, so that they could deliver on their mission? Is this where conversations around coalition building or partnerships or mergers or networks should be at play here? I mean, because clearly what you're identifying when you're saying that employees on the front lines who are delivering services for charities, who are paid employees, who are struggling to feed themselves and their family, um, that should be an issue that is relevant to the whole sector, and certainly to the funders that to understand that, because it relates to our cost of living, and also our capacity to be able to deliver the services to those most greatly in need. I mean, that's an important policy matter.
Yeah, and I think like one of the things I just would think's worth starting out talking about is I do think we have increasing issues of recognizing the importance of the work that some of these local community organizations do. I mean, one of the things I find really fascinating when we look at the sort of the biggest sort of level picture is looking at some of the work that's really gotten a lot of attention in the last couple of years that Robert Putnam has done around social capital. And so one of his seminal pieces of research was focused on Italy. Back when they were creating local regional governments, and he was trying to figure out like what predicts the subsequent success of a local regional government. And he looked at a lot of the traditional factors like education and income, and a lot of these other things that people would typically associate with like a local government having the ability to be effective. And what he ended up finding is one of the best predictors of whether a local government was successful was the presence of local community groups, like ranging from choral societies to like religious groups to sports organizations. And it was really focused on the local. And I think like, a lot of times when we have these conversations nowadays, these things are viewed as overhead, administration, inefficiency. I mean, when you look at the big picture, though, like these are examples of when people come together to collaborate, to create groups where they can share common experiences, and sometimes spend time with people who might be quite different from them, where they can build networks and connections and sort of have a real opportunity to connect with those who are making decisions in their local government. And so this was what he found was one of the strongest predictors of the success of government, was actually these sorts of local institutions. And often when we have the conversations now, people are like, oh, those things are a waste of money. We should be merging them. We should be centralizing them. We should be getting rid of these local branches and, having a centralized staff in Toronto or Ottawa, and like that's sort of where we've ended up, and it's become an acceptable conversation. And I think this is a really terrifying conversation when you think like this is one of the best predictors of whether government is effective. Like this is where people felt like they had an opportunity to influence the decisions that were being made that affect their lives. And this is something that's really, when we look at where all the funds have gone over the last decade, those top 150 organizations, they're not local, organizations trying to just build strong communities. They're national organizations. And, so much of why, national organizations are able to increase their funds is because of marketing and brand and the ability to attract funders from everywhere. And that allows them to really have the capacity to grow. But it also is antithetical to the need for having local strong organizations for people to have a sense of trust and belonging in their local community, and that the government is actually doing important work to help their lives get better. And I think when we look at sort of some of the challenges over the last decade, like, if we look in the mid 90s, 32% of Canadians reported a charitable donation on their tax receipt. Now it's down to about 16%. So we've lost like half of our donor base. I mean, millions and millions and millions of donors. And typically it is the smaller donors that we've lost. I mean, they might only be giving a couple $100 each, but I mean, collectively, that means billions of dollars. And collectively, I think a lot of those donations we've lost are ones that would have been previously going to local community organizations to strengthen our local grassroots social fabric. And that's what we've lost. And I think like when we talk to funders is like, question is, how do we rebuild that? Like, how do we give some of these small organizations again the capacity to tap into some of these things that we used to be able to do at scale, and now that we're no longer doing it at all? And when we've lost half of our fundraising base, it means that we're going to be incredibly focused on a few ultra net worth, high net worth individuals. And really, when you look about like 50,000 individuals in any given year are donating about 40% of all charitable donations. And those 50,000 individuals have an incredible influence on how the process works. And part of that is because how much the donor base has shrunk. That gives them so much more space to be the ones who are incredibly influencing the conversation. And so I think from a funder's perspective and for government perspective, like we really do want to be able to get a lot of these community organizations back into being able to actually successfully engage their communities. And that's going to require some funding as well. And I think that's one of the things that, certainly there's a lot of things that the community organizations themselves can do, but I think like all of those who are working on the social infrastructure in the space should be, figure out how can they encourage it, how can they accelerate it, how can they do more? Because like we do need to re-engage every community if we're going to be able to make sure that these small organizations have the resources that they need.
Well, exactly. I mean, we are going into a potential recession. We are in the midst of a trade war that we have no idea whether it's going to get worse or better. There's enormous uncertainty. It's impacting global markets. We are in a perilous moment, and it seems that it's a time when the sector should be taking action to being in a position to be able to have their voice heard about these challenges that they're facing every day. And it's the frontline people that have that perspective, and those tend to be smaller organizations. So what is the best solutions for them to actually have their voices heard and have the scenarios that you've just described be better represented, so that they don't get passed by when the government is making decisions about how they're going to fund programs to be able to allow the economy and the society to be able to survive this. I mean, it's not unlike the pandemic in the sense that it could have a very serious crisis in our economy, and therefore on our cost of living in everything. So do we need more umbrella organizations? Do we need more networking? What is the way for smaller organizations to sort of get over this, or have a more equal voice, at least more equitable representation among these 50,000 very wealthy individuals who apparently do have the voice of the policymakers? That's extraordinary statistic that you just gave. I'm just very, very taken aback by that. Naturally, they're going to have the largest voice about it. It only makes sense. But what can we do to right the balance a bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's it's certainly not an easy question to answer. I will say, like, I mean, when we do have crisis, I think is the one time that we have seen some really successful results. I mean, if you look at the pandemic itself, I mean, federal government transferred unprecedented billions of dollars to every corner of the charitable sector in a way that they'd never done before. And certainly, I mean, to some degree, it was required. At the same time, it was also the result of advocacy from a lot of different organizations working together, pointing to the things like we need everything from ensuring that the programs that are being rolled out to businesses are also rolled out to charities. And if you look at so many programs that have been rolled out over the years, that is not a safe assumption that just because they're just supporting businesses in a certain way that they're also going to be supporting charities. And we see things like the emergency community support funds, where like a direct flow of funds that was distributed across like almost every community in this country was getting funds from it. And I think like in terms of like the crisis allowed people to really prioritize initiatives and actually get things flowing to across the entire country. And I think like a lot of the folks who were working on policy during those days, I mean, may not get full credit for it, but like they did do a phenomenal job helping ensure that an unprecedented amount of money went to charities across the entire country. I think like it is an example that when folks are aligned in the same direction and understand the magnitude of a crisis, like we can get successful results. And if we're going into a whole another series of crisis with trade wars and recessions. Like I hope that similarly, we can have something similar. And certainly, like there was a lot of work being done to understand the needs around the entire country to help to get that. At the same time as like I think the crisis as well as the planning around it like did allow people to focus on like how do we make sure that everyone gets the help they need. And that was a time that message resonated, and I certainly hope that if we're going into another recession, like getting people really aligned on that idea that we need to make sure that everyone gets support, and we need to sort of have different opportunities for people to have ways to tap into some of this government funding that they wouldn't normally get, might be a way to do so.
Well, I guess that then can help us wrap up this discussion. I mean, are there things that we learned from the pandemic that we think might be critical for the not-for-profit and charitable sector to be able to replicate if we are going into this very precarious economic sort of environment that we anticipate and where we believe are in now, or many people do, um, in order to be able to ensure that, I guess, um, there's more equity, but also a better clarity on what the real issues that are happening in that many of the larger organizations may not be aware of.
Yeah. Mhm. Like I think on the pandemic, like, especially when we look at that first year, I mean, there was a lot of things that were quite unique about it in terms of, I think people were working in a way that was quite different from how they've worked historically. And like it was genuinely collaborative. They were trying to get on the same page. There was the real focus on like, how do we get as much resources to as many people as possible and, as effectively as possible. And I think like coming to that sort of everyone being very aligned on that, and including the government, really, did result in, an entirely different sort of, outcome than it could have. I mean, there were, I mean, I don't know the exact number, but I mean, you know, many, many, many billions of dollars that were transferred, across CERB, across, different, all sorts of different programs, including the, billions that were distributed for the emergency community support program. I mean, so really, I think the scale of that is key. Like, I think one of the things that's very hard to take from a crisis is that I think people really want to fund, they want to put funds out for a year or two, and crises, they don't end in a year or two. The consequences last longer, no matter what they are. I mean, and you can see so many lingering effects of the pandemic. And I think like one of the things, when we look at any of these sorts of things, like it can easy to be like, okay, like we did so much, now we're tired, and like we can sort of ease up. And I think like you can see that the consequences on food insecurity, I mean, mental health, across the entire country, like so many charities reporting increased demand for services, with no subsequent increase in funding and fewer volunteer resources. I mean, these are all the ongoing impacts of the pandemic. And there was a lot of support for the first 2 years, but less thought being put into the longer term consequences, which we're still in. And now we're potentially facing other things being put on top of those. And I do think like, the one opportunity in crisis is always it allows people to think differently. It allows people to potentially come together with folks that they might have struggled to come together. And you can see like even when the surveys of people asking about patriotism, which has been dropping pretty steady for the last 30-40 years, like this is the biggest, one of the biggest single increases we've seen in terms of as long as people have been measuring it. Hopefully, maybe that will also translate to people realizing, hey, like we should really be investing in local communities and some of the community organizations that really are closest to me, and finding opportunities to do that as well as they're thinking about like people are thinking about buying local. You also donate local, like it's hopefully there's some things like that that can also come out of crisis, because like we did see a really tremendous response in the first year of the pandemic. It's just sometimes hard to sustain those in the longer term.
Well, you raise an interesting point that I did ask other guests, which was, we've certainly seen the Canadian public unify in ways that we haven't seen in literally decades, and if ever, I mean, in my lifetime, around the importance of protecting Canada and how and our sovereignty, along with trying to do more to make us more independent and stronger. Um, is there a capacity or a possibility of having that galvanize an effort in the nonprofit sector to bring together this sense of unity for changing things and ensuring that all Canadians are taken care of as we go into these very, very complicated and uncertain times. Do you think that we might be seeing a bit more of that in future? Is that a possibility?
I certainly hope so. Like it's such, it's like it's always difficult to see like how enduring will this moment be, and like what are the sort of the consequences. Like I think like a lot of the challenges we face like do require people to be working together differently than they have before, and like any opportunity we have to when more people realize it, and to realize like there's many challenges in the charitable sector, absolutely, but we also have an incredibly sophisticated charitable sector compared to almost any country in the world, and like there is certainly a lot here to build on, and I think having people appreciate and recognize like there is, despite its many flaws, something that like great here, and that's why so many people care so passionately about it, and like align on that. I do think like when we look at so much of the decline in donations over recent years, like the more we use any opportunity to for a crisis to remind people like these are what local community organizations are doing and how impactful they are, like certainly there's a tremendous opportunity. But I think one of the things, like, with any of these sorts of things, like support has to be sustained, whether it's from individuals, whether it's from funders, from government. Like a 1 year support can be really helpful. It's not as helpful as a 10-year plan to, or if you're not a donor, like being a monthly donor and just keeping that up for as long as possible, or sort of, for funders, like making sure there's multi-year commitments, not just 1 year, and like really planning this out, the types of investments to be made are not going to be like one-offs. Like if you're going to change anything, like it requires really sustained effort. And I think like that's also one of the really key takeaways is like we want to seize any momentum that we can, but also realize like seize it, but make the plan for the long term.
I hear you. I think that's right. Stephen, as always, it's great to speak to you and get the benefit of your keen insights. It'll be very helpful for nonprofits and charities to navigate these really challenging times, and especially as they're struggling to gain a greater voice and achieve more equitable level of influence and funding within the sector and better reflect the diverse communities that they serve. Thank you for joining us on Charity Village Connects.
Thank you for having me.